I learned to stop asking questions the day I found the finger in the grinder. Not a whole finger, just the top joint, pale and waxy, wedged between the teeth of the mechanism we used to process the protein blocks. I stood there in the chemical steam of the prep tent, holding that small piece of someone, and Sergeant Kale looked at me with those tired eyes that had seen 30 years of war and said, "Flavoring, add salt." Then he walked away, and I understood that this was my life now, that the Imperial Guard had need of cooks just as much as it needed soldiers, and that I would feed the war machine until it consumed me too. My name was Torian Vass, and I have been a regimental cook for the 47th Valhallan Mixed Infantry for 8 years, 4 months, and 17 days. I say was, because I am not certain what I am anymore, whether a man who cooks can still be called a cook when he knows what goes into the pot, when his hands have grown so calloused to horror that they no longer shake when portioning the rations. I write this in the dim red glow of the nutrient tent, the recyclers humming their endless drone, the smell of rendered fat and chemical preservatives so thick I can taste it with every breath. Outside, the artillery pounds at the enemy positions, a rhythm I have lived with so long it has become my heartbeat. Boom, pause, boom, pause. The war goes on, and the soldiers must eat. They recruited me from a Hive City processing plant on a world whose name I have forgotten. The administratum came through with their quotas and their data slates, and they said the Guard needed support personnel, that cooking was an honorable service to the Emperor, that I would be fed and clothed and given purpose. I was young then, 23, and stupid, thinking that anything was better than the grinding sameness of the protein vats back home. I signed the papers they put in front of me, and they loaded me onto a troop transport with 200 other conscripts, and we traveled through the warp to a war I had never heard of on a world I could not pronounce. The first thing they teach you in battlefield cooking is that nothing goes to waste. Everything has value. The meat that arrives in the frozen cargo containers from the supply ships process it, all of it, even the parts that look wrong. The vegetables from the local requisitions, half-rotted and crawling with things, boil them long enough and the toxins break down. The water from the purification units that tastes of metal and makes your teeth ache, add enough flavor concentrate and the soldiers won't complain. Waste is heresy against the Emperor's resources, they told us. Every meal we prepare feeds a soldier who kills in his name. We were part of the war effort, essential as ammunition, and we would do our duty or face the commissars. I believed them at first. I wanted to believe. The training facility on the transport ship was clean and organized, and the instructors were professional men who taught us proper knife technique and portion control, and the mysteries of the field kitchens that would become our world. They showed us how to operate the massive boiling units, the grinders, the chemical seasoning dispensers, the protein reconstitutors. They taught us the prayers to the machine god that would keep the equipment running, the proper way to test food for contamination, the imperial regulations governing meal preparation in active war zones. It felt important. It felt like I was learning a trade. Then we made landfall, and I learned what battlefield cooking really meant. The 47th was engaged in a protracted siege campaign on a world called Graven's Deep, I think that was the name, though after a while all the war zones blur together into a single landscape of mud and fire and despair. The enemy was entrenched in the ruins of a hive city, and our regiment was tasked with breaking their positions through sustained assault and attrition. My first assignment was to report to the mess tent complex in the rear staging area, a collection of leaking canvas structures erected around a cluster of mobile cooking units. Sergeant Kale was already there, along with 4 other cooks, all of them hollow-eyed and silent, moving through their tasks with the mechanical precision of servitors. The smell hit me first, that thick, cloying odor of boiled meat and chemical additives, undercut with something sour and organic that made my stomach clench. Then the sound, the industrial grinding of the processors, the hiss of the steam vents, the bubbling roar of the massive cookpots, and the heat. Emperor's mercy, the heat. Even with the ventilation fans running at full capacity, the interior of the tent was a sweltering hell. and within minutes I was soaked with sweat, my uniform clinging to my skin. "You're the new one," Kale said. It wasn't a question. He was a wiry man with burn scars on his forearms and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. "You know how to work a grinder?" I nodded, though my experience was with small-scale processing units, nothing like the massive industrial machines that dominated the tent. "Good. We've got a shipment of protein coming in from supply. Needs to be processed and portioned by 0600 hours. That's when the morning meal goes out." He gestured to a pallet stacked with sealed containers, each one marked with Imperial supply codes and a stamped icon of the Aquila. "Start with those. Run everything through twice to ensure consistency. Add standard seasoning mix at 2% by weight. Questions?" Quote, I had questions, many questions, but the way Kale looked at me suggested that asking them would be unwise, so I simply said, "No, Sergeant," and moved to the pallet. The containers were cold to the touch, frost still clinging to their seals despite the heat of the tent. I cracked the first one open and found it filled with chunks of frozen meat, grey-pink and marbled with fat, the texture slightly wrong in a way I couldn't immediately identify. It looked like protein, it smelled like protein, but there was something about it that made the hair on the back of my neck prickle. I loaded it into the grinder anyway, because that was what I had been told to do. The machine roared to life, its teeth churning through the frozen meat with brutal efficiency, reducing it to a paste that oozed out into the collection tray. I worked steadily, methodically, opening container after container, feeding the machine, watching the paste accumulate. It was mindless work, the kind that let your thoughts wander, and I found myself thinking about home, about the girl I had left behind, about whether I would ever see the Hive City again. That was when I found the finger. It was in the 6th container, mixed in with the regular meat, and at first I thought it was just an odd-shaped piece of gristle. Then I saw the nail, blackened and cracked, but unmistakably human, and my brain made the connection it had been refusing to make since I opened the first container. The texture, the color, the slightly off smell. This wasn't animal meat. I stood there, frozen, the finger resting in my palm, and 100 thoughts cascaded through my mind at once. Where did this come from? Who was this? Why is it in the food supply? And the worst question, the one that made my stomach turn, have I been eating this? Kale appeared at my shoulder, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned to walk softly in dangerous places. He glanced at the finger, then at me, and that was when he said it. Flavoring. Add salt. And he walked away. I stood there for a long time, the grinder still running, the finger still in my hand. I could have reported it. I could have gone to the commissar, demanded an explanation, refused to continue, but I knew, somewhere deep in the animal part of my brain that understood survival, that asking questions would not end well. The Imperium does not waste resources. The war must be fed, and if the protein shipments contained more than advertised, well, that was simply the cost of logistics in a galaxy where billions died every day. I threw the finger back into the grinder and finished my shift. That night, I lay in my assigned bunk in the support personnel barracks, listening to the artillery and trying not to think about what I had processed. The other cooks slept soundly, their breathing steady and untroubled, and I realized they already knew. They had all found their own fingers, their own pieces of evidence, and they had all made the same choice I had: to survive, to serve, to not ask questions that had no good answers. In the morning, we served breakfast. 6,000 soldiers lined up with their mess kits, and we portioned out the protein paste, the reconstituted grain blocks, the weak tea that passed for a stimulant. The soldiers ate without complaint, their faces blank with exhaustion, their thoughts already on the assault that would come at dawn. They didn't know. They didn't want to know. And I understood, in that moment, that my job was not to feed them, it was to let them believe they were being fed. The weeks blurred together after that. We established a routine, a rhythm of preparation and service that matched the tempo of the war. Shipments arrived. We processed them. We served the meals. The soldiers ate, fought, died, and were replaced by new soldiers who looked just like them. And the meat kept coming, container after container, and I stopped looking at it too closely, stopped trying to identify what I was processing, because that way lay madness. But I noticed things. Small things. Inconsistencies that gnawed at the edges of my awareness. The shipments came irregularly, not according to any supply schedule I could discern. Sometimes we would receive 3 pallets in a single day, and sometimes we would go a week with nothing, forced to stretch our existing stores with creative substitutions. The containers themselves varied. Some were marked with proper supply codes, while others bore no markings at all, just blank grey surfaces that suggested they had been scrubbed clean of identifying information. And the meat itself changed. Sometimes it was lean and relatively fresh, the texture almost normal. Other times it was tough and fibrous, shot through with gristle and connective tissue that required multiple passes through the grinder to break down. Once, we received a shipment that was so degraded it barely qualified as organic material, and Kale made us add extra chemical preservatives to mask the smell of decay. "Where does it come from?" I asked Kale one night, when we were alone in the tent doing inventory. It was a violation of my unspoken rule about questions, but curiosity had been building in me like pressure in a sealed container, and I needed to release it before I burst. Kale was counting portions, his stylus moving across the data slate with mechanical precision. He didn't look up. "Supply," he said. "But where does supply get it? Does it matter?" "It matters to me." He finally looked at me then, and there was something in his eyes that might have been pity, or might have been contempt. "You want the official answer, or the real answer?" "The real answer." "There are no supply lines," he said. "Not anymore. We're 3 sectors deep into enemy territory, and the warp storms have been cutting off reinforcement convoys for 6 months. The ships that do make it through barely have enough ammunition and fuel to keep the offensive running. Food is a secondary concern at best." "Then where?" "Local procurement," Kale interrupted. "That's the official term, requisitioning indigenous resources to maintain operational readiness." I stared at him. "Indigenous resources? You mean we're taking it from the local population?" "I mean we're using what's available." His voice was flat, emotionless. "The enemy holds the Hive City. There are no civilians left there. They evacuated or died in the initial fighting. But there are bodies, thousands of them, tens of thousands. And the Imperium has a very practical approach to resource management." The tent suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. "Are you saying—" "I'm not saying anything," Kale said. "I'm explaining logistics." The Munitorium assessed the situation and determined that field processing of available biological material was more efficient than waiting for supply shipments that might never arrive. They set up rendering stations in the occupied zones, staffed by servitors and penal labor conscripts. The material gets processed, packaged, and distributed to unit mess facilities. It's all very organized, very efficient. "It's not just enemies," I said, the realization hitting me like a lasgun blast. "It's our own dead too, the wounded who don't make it, the soldiers who—" "Everyone serves the Emperor," Kale said. "In life or death, this is just another form of service." He returned his attention to the data slate. "Now finish the inventory. We've got morning meal in 7 hours." I wanted to vomit. I wanted to run. I wanted to report this to someone, anyone, some authority who could stop this madness. But I knew there was no authority that would care. This was the Imperium. This was war. And in war, everything was justified in service to the Emperor. I finished the inventory. I served the morning meal. I continued my work, but something had changed inside me. The horror had nested in my chest, a cold weight that never went away, and I began to see the operation differently. I began to notice patterns. The soldiers who came through the line looked thinner each week, their faces more gaunt, their movements more mechanical. At first I attributed it to combat stress, to the grinding nature of siege warfare. But then I realized it was more than that. They were eating less because they were eating something that didn't sustain them properly. Human meat lacks certain nutrients that our bodies need. Process it enough. Add enough chemicals. And you can disguise what it is. But you can't make it nutritionally complete. The soldiers were slowly starving even as they consumed their rations, their bodies cannibalizing themselves to supplement what the food couldn't provide. The medics reported increasing cases of disease, strange infections, vitamin deficiencies, digestive problems that the standard antibiotics couldn't treat. The commissariat attributed it to environmental factors, to the stress of combat, to the emperor testing the faithful. But I knew the truth. We were poisoning them. Slowly, methodically, we were feeding the regiment its own dead, and the poison was cumulative. I watched soldiers grow sick and die, their bodies carried away to be processed, to be fed back to their comrades. It was a cycle, a horrifying Ouroboros of consumption and death. And we were the facilitators, the cooks who made it possible. One night, I tried to calculate how many meals I had prepared, how many soldiers I had fed. The numbers became meaningless. After a while, thousands upon thousands of portions, an endless stream of meat paste and grain blocks and reconstituted nutrients. Each meal represented a fraction of a person, someone who had died in service to the Imperium and been rendered down to basic organic components. I had processed hundreds of bodies, maybe thousands, without ever seeing their faces or knowing their names. The weight of it crushed me. I stopped sleeping well. I stopped eating the rations, subsisting instead on the grain and vegetables, telling myself that as long as I didn't consume the protein I was somehow less complicit. But I knew it was a lie. I was already complicit. My hands prepared the food. My labor made this possible. I was as much a part of the machine as the grinders and the boilers. I considered desertion, but deserters were shot. I considered sabotage, but that would only hurt the soldiers, and they were victims in this just as much as I was. I considered suicide, but that felt like cowardice, an escape from responsibility rather than a principled stand. So I kept working, and I began to pay attention to the smaller details, the things that might reveal more about the system I was trapped in. The containers came from different sources. I confirmed that by examining the transport codes stamped on their exteriors. Some came from the front lines, marked with tactical unit designations. Others came from the rear areas, from field hospitals and casualty collection points. And some, the ones that bothered me most, came from the local processing stations that Kale had mentioned, facilities I had never seen but could imagine all too clearly. I started keeping a private log, recording the codes and quantities, trying to map the supply chain. It was dangerous. If the commissariat found it, I would be executed for sedition or unauthorized intelligence gathering. But I needed to understand. I needed to know the full scope of what was happening. What I discovered was worse than I imagined. The system was vast, coordinated. It wasn't just our regiment. According to the transport codes, dozens of units were receiving the same shipments, all supplied by the same network of processing facilities. This wasn't a desperate improvisation by a single commander. This was policy, sanctioned at the highest levels of the Munitorium. Someone, somewhere, had looked at the logistics of the campaign and decided that recycling the dead was more efficient than maintaining proper supply lines. And they were right. Horrifyingly, pragmatically right. The recycling system worked. It kept the soldiers fed barely, and it solved the massive problem of what to do with thousands of corpses in an active war zone. It was efficient, brutal, and utterly in keeping with the Imperium's philosophy of resource optimization. I hated that I could see the logic of it. I hated even more that I had become numb to it. One day, we received a special shipment, a single unmarked container, smaller than the usual pallets, delivered directly by commissariat transport. Kale opened it himself, his expression unreadable, and inside were cuts of meat that were immediately different from the usual processed blocks. These were fresh, relatively fresh, and they were carefully butchered, the cuts precise and professional. "Command staff meal," Kale said. "Officers only. You'll prepare this separately, using the small prep station. Standard seasoning, but add the spice mix from the secure locker, the red container." I did as instructed, setting up at the isolated prep station that we used for special requisitions. The meat was better quality than what we normally processed, though that wasn't saying much. But as I worked, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a tattoo, just a fragment, a small section of ink preserved on a strip of skin that had been carelessly left attached to one of the cuts. I recognized the pattern. It was a regimental marking from the 47th. This was one of ours. Not an enemy casualty, not a civilian, but a soldier from our own regiment. The red spice mix turned out to be a psychoactive compound, something that would enhance mood and suppress questioning thoughts. I added it as instructed, my hands moving automatically while my mind reeled. They were feeding the officers their own men, and they were drugging them to make them compliant about it. I served the meal. The officers ate and complimented the preparation, and I returned to the main tent to process the regular shipment, the one that would feed the rank and file, the ordinary soldiers who were being consumed by their own army. The siege dragged on. Weeks became months. The front line barely moved, just a grinding back and forth of trench assaults and artillery exchanges. The casualty reports were staggering: hundreds dead every day, thousands wounded, a meat grinder in the most literal sense. And we kept cooking. We kept serving. The system functioned, but I was changing. I could feel it happening, a slow erosion of something essential inside me. I stopped thinking of the meat as having been people. It became material, units to be processed, numbers on inventory sheets. I optimized my workflow, finding ways to increase throughput and reduce waste. I got better at my job, more efficient, more skilled. I became exactly what the Imperium needed me to be, and I hated myself for it. The other cooks and I rarely spoke anymore. We existed in parallel, each of us locked in our own private hell, performing our tasks with mechanical precision. Sometimes I caught one of them staring into space, their eyes distant and hollow, and I wondered if they were thinking the same thoughts I was, if they were calculating their own complicity, their own damnation. Kale died in an artillery strike that collapsed part of the mess tent complex. We found him under the rubble, his body crushed but still recognizably human. They carried him away, and 2 days later we received a shipment that included several containers of the same approximate mass. I didn't ask. I just processed the material and moved on. I was assigned to lead cook after that, responsible for coordinating the entire feeding operation for the regiment. It was a promotion, technically. More responsibility, more culpability. I accepted it because refusing would draw attention, and attention was dangerous. In my new role, I had access to more information supply manifests, logistical reports, communications from the munitorium. I learned that our situation was not unique. Across the sector, in dozens of campaigns, the same recycling systems were in operation. It was standard procedure now, a tested and validated method of sustainment warfare. There were manuals about it, technical documents describing optimal processing techniques and nutritional supplementation ratios. I read them all. I learned the approved methods for field rendering, the proper chemical treatments to prevent disease transmission, the ideal grinding settings for different tissue types. I became an expert in the logistics of cannibalism because that's what the Imperium needed. And then something unexpected happened. We started receiving shipments from a new source, containers marked with unfamiliar codes that didn't match any of the patterns I had documented. The meat inside was different, leaner, darker, with a texture that suggested non-human origin. At first I thought it might be actual animal protein, some breakthrough in supply logistics. But the taste was wrong, and the processing requirements were unusual. I brought my concerns to the supply officer, a tired lieutenant who managed logistics for the entire staging area. He reviewed the manifests and frowned. "These aren't standard munitorium issue," he said. They're marked as salvage operations. Must be from the Xenos clearance teams. Genos? I asked. The enemy isn't human on this world, he explained, pulling up data on his slate. Never has been. They're some kind of indigenous species tool-using, but not fully sentient by Imperial classification. The siege is about clearing them from resource-rich territories. We've been processing captured enemy combatants through the same facilities we use for our own casualties, more efficient than disposal, and it adds variety to the protein supply. I stared at him. We've been feeding the soldiers human meat this entire time, and you're telling me the enemy wasn't even human to begin with? He looked at me like I was an idiot. Of course we've been using human protein. What did you think battlefield cooking was? The Xenos protein is a new addition, something they're testing for widespread implementation. Should help with the nutritional deficiency problems we've been seeing. He handed the slate back. Process it normally. The chemical composition is compatible with human digestive systems. They tested it on penal conscripts last month. I took the slate. I returned to the tent. I processed the alien meat, just like I processed everything else. And something broke inside me. Not spectacularly. Not with any dramatic revelation or sudden crisis of conscience. Just a quiet, final shattering of whatever had been holding me together, and in its place, a terrible clarity. This was the Imperium. This was what it meant to serve. Not noble sacrifice or heroic struggle, but the slow, grinding reduction of everything, including humanity itself, into fuel for the war machine. We ate our dead because it was efficient. We ate the enemy because waste was heresy. And soon, when the current campaigns ended and new ones began, we would eat whoever was convenient, because that was the logic of eternal war. I had thought I was cooking to support soldiers. I had thought I was part of the supply chain, a necessary function in a vast military organization. But I understood now that I was something else entirely. I was a priest in the true religion of the Imperium, the religion of consumption, of endless appetite, of the eternal hunger that drove humanity to devour itself in service to a dying god. The soldiers came through the line in the morning, and I portioned out their meals with practiced efficiency. Protein paste, grain blocks, weak tea. They ate without questioning, without thinking about what they consumed, because thinking was dangerous and hunger was immediate. And I watched them, these walking corpses who would fight and die and be fed back to their replacements, and I felt nothing. That was when I knew I was truly lost. The numbness lasted for months. I performed my duties flawlessly, earning commendations from the command staff for my efficiency and dedication. I trained new cooks as they arrived, teaching them the same lessons Kale had taught me, watching them discover the same horrible truths and make the same choices. The cycle continued, perpetual and unchanging, but there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when the horror broke through the numbness, when I would catch sight of a soldier's face in the meal line and recognize something in their expression. Some spark of the person they had been before the war ground them down, or when I would process a shipment and find something unexpected, a personal item, a letter, some small piece of identity that had survived the rendering process, and remember that these had been people with names and histories and lives. Those moments were agony. They reminded me that I had not always been this hollow thing, that I had once believed in something beyond mere survival, but they passed quickly, swallowed by the routine of preparation and service, and I would return to the comfortable numbness that made continued existence possible. The siege ended eventually. The 47th broke through the enemy defenses, cleared the hive city, and secured the territory for Imperial exploitation. Victory was declared. Celebrations were held. The soldiers who survived were given medals and promotions, their service recorded in regimental histories that would gather dust in some archive nobody would ever read, and I was transferred to a new campaign, loaded onto a transport with the other support personnel, shipped off to another war on another world, where the logistics would be the same, and the cooking would be the same, and everything would be the same, except the names. That was 5 years ago. Since then, I have served in 12 campaigns, cooked on 20 different worlds, processed thousands of tons of protein through industrial grinders and chemical vats. I have trained hundreds of cooks, watched most of them die or break or succumb to the same numbness that claimed me. I have perfected the art of battlefield cooking, learned every technique and optimization, become an expert in the field. I have also kept my records, updated and expanded them, documented every aspect of the system I have been able to observe. I know which processing facilities are most efficient, which chemical treatments are most effective, which grinding settings produce the best texture for different tissue types. I know the truth about what the Imperium feeds its soldiers, and I know that this truth will never matter, because the Imperium does not care about truth, it cares only about continuation. I write this now in the moments between shifts, the recyclers humming their eternal drone, the smell of rendered fat thick in my lungs. Outside, a new war rages, and soon I will begin preparing the morning meal for soldiers who do not know and must not know what they eat. I will portion out the protein paste with mechanical precision, and they will consume it gratefully, and some of them will die today, and their bodies will be processed, and tomorrow I will serve them to their comrades. This is my service. This is my damnation. I am a battlefield cook in the Imperial Guard, and I feed the war with itself. There are no more questions to ask, no more revelations to horrify me, no more depths to plumb. I have seen the full scope of the machine, understood its logic, and been consumed by it. I am part of it now, inseparable from its function, and I will continue my work until I die, or until the Imperium no longer has need of cooks. But I want you to understand, whoever finds this, if anyone ever does, that I did not start as a monster. I was an ordinary man who thought he could serve honorably, who believed in duty and sacrifice and the nobility of supporting those who fought. The Imperium made me into what I am. It took my humanity piece by piece, ground it down through routine and horror and necessity, until all that remained was function. I tell myself that I did what I had to do to survive, that anyone in my position would have made the same choices, that the alternative was death, and death serves no purpose. But I know these are lies I tell myself to make sleep possible. The truth is simpler and more terrible. I chose this. Every day, I choose this. I could refuse. I could resist. I could accept execution rather than continue. But I don't, because some small animal part of me still clings to existence, still wants to see another sunrise, still hopes that somehow this will end. It won't end. I know that now. This is the Imperium, and the Imperium is eternal. The war will continue long after I am dead, and other cooks will stand where I stand, processing the same materials, serving the same meals, becoming the same hollow things I have become. The system is perfect in its horror, self-sustaining, and impossible to escape. So I write this as testimony, as evidence, as the only act of defiance I am capable of, to record what I have seen and done, to bear witness to the machine even as I serve it. Remember that I was human once. Remember that we all were. And when you eat your rations, given freely by the Munitorum and blessed by the priests, remember that the Imperium wastes nothing, that all serve the Emperor in death as in life, and that the protein paste you consume with such gratitude was made by hands like mine from meat that once had names. This is the truth they do not tell you when they recruit you for support personnel. This is the secret at the heart of Imperial logistics. This is how the war is fed, and I am the cook who makes it possible. May the Emperor forgive me, though I know he won't. May someone, someday, read these words and understand what we have become. May the Imperium burn for what it has made us do. But until that impossible day, I will return to my post. The morning meal must be prepared. The soldiers must be fed. The war must continue. And I will portion out the protein paste with practiced hands, and smile as they thank me for the food, and know that I am damning them with every serving, and do it anyway, because that is what battlefield cooks do in the Imperium of man. We feed the war with itself. Always. Forever. until nothing remains but the grinding of machinery and the smell of rendered fat and the terrible, eternal hunger that can never be satisfied. I am Cook Torian Vass, serial number 470834 Delta, and I confess my sins, knowing they will never be absolved. The Emperor protects, but he does not protect us from ourselves.